Hi, my name is Lisbeth, and I will be doing a teach back on the Picture Perfect American Family. These days, it doesn't exist reading that we had for this week. So, when it comes to class activity, I decided to use a Venn diagram. And so, how it would work within the classroom is there would be, if there's a classroom of 25 or more, um, each student will be put in a group. If there's less, then it would be individual unless students request to be within a group. Basically, what the Venn diagram would be, um, it would be comparing and contrast on what they think the ideal American family is versus what they see in their own families. And this include behaviors, family roles, income, how much should a family make versus what their family makes if they want to include that, living areas, does the ideal family live in a house, an apartment, and community? Do they live in the suburbs or in the city? And one of the reasons why I decided to choose a Venn diagram and put this class activity to the forefront rather to the towards the end of the teach back is because I always feel like me as a student, I always like to show my professors kind of what I know about the subject that they're going to talk about. So that way, if I have some good knowledge about the subject, professors can go more in depth and provide more examples. And I know for me personally, in classes that I've been, not every student has the opportunity to know so much about certain subjects, certain sociological theories. So it's always good to be sharing and communicating with your classmates, like, hey, this is what I think the ideal American family structure is based on my experience of X, Y, and Z, or this is how I see my family. Like it provides them that real world application to kind of see how some of the things that they learned in the article can be applied. And then also it'll be like a nice reflection to look back after we're done with the teach back, just so that way they can compare on what they thought was the ideal American structure versus what the reading says, which the reading states that currently in modern times there isn't really like an ideal American structure, just because society has gone through so many like massive changes within the past few decades. So when it comes to the Venn diagram, this is how it's going to look like. There is going to be the ideal American family structure on one side and the student's family structure on the other. They don't exactly have to put them exactly like the Venn diagram, but it should look something like this. And in the middle, that's where they'll find similarities and discuss about it. As a class, we'll discuss like why are there similarities there? Is it from a societal perspective that perhaps that some of our family structures within our own families is being replicated by society because that's what society demands. And then again, basically the end goal for this activity is that towards the end of the lecture, it kind of clicks that this activity kind of shows them that there really isn't a concrete definition of what an ideal American family is nowadays. That currently right now, it's kind of up in the air of what an ideal American family unit should look like, or even if we should even use that concept. So kind of like the Venn diagram, I also wanted to see exactly like what students kind of know beforehand, before they started the reading or after they started the reading. So these pre-lecture questions, they kind of have to do with the reading, but at the same time, it's also based on what they think, what their knowledge comes from. So the first one is based on the class activity, which is how would you define the ideal American family? If they did it in groups, they would basically agree and write down what their definition is, and they would present in the class like, hey, based on our group Venn diagram, this is what we think the ideal American family structure is. The second question, how would you describe a family unit living during the 1950s? That's based on their own previous knowledge. What do they know about families in the 1950s? So that way, once they're doing the reading and then the teach back, they can kind of compare and contrast. Like, oh, this is what I also wrote for a 1950 family, or oh, they didn't discuss about this aspect, but I think it should be good that we should discuss it as a class because I still think if it's within that ideal American family structure that is talked about within the reading during the 1950s. And then the third question, how would you compare a 1950 family compared to a modern family? Again, this is just based on their opinion and their previous knowledge, just so that way, as they're doing the lecture, the reading, they can kind of compare and contrast what they originally thought was what what they originally thought was their comparison, whether or not it still holds up, or if they could add more to it, or if they feel that the reading and the lecture didn't really provide them, a lot of substance, and they can further add into that discussion. And so the fourth one, do you think the concept of the ideal American family can be impacted by religious, political, and moral beliefs? This one again has to do with the reading, just because the reading it discusses how not one out of these three factors impacts how a family perceives their family structure. It's not just one factor is above all else. Rather, it depends on where the individual within the family kind of stands within like the religious and political spectrum, and just like what is their moral beliefs about what family should be. The fifth question is, how is the ideal American family portrayed in media, specifically in politics? For that one, I just wanted to add like a broad question to kind of see um, how students, how students see family units portrayed, if they're portrayed as the ideal American family units, but also tying it to the political side that was discussed in the article about political families, kind of trying to break the barriers of like the traditional American family, which is like a heterosexual couple with children who have never remarried or have never divorced. The sixth question is, what sort of changes have you seen in media, particularly politics, in regard to diversifying the concept of the ideal American family? Again, this is just based on previous knowledge, and the author discusses a lot of examples such as the Obamas, the Reagans, the McCains, the Bidens. So they can discuss those examples if they know about them. If not, they can always rely on other forms of media and just kind of, again, do that compare and contrast. Like, okay, this is what I know, and this is what the reading is telling me. What's the difference? What's the same? Again, using the application of that Venn diagram to just kind of have them thinking critically, what things they can discuss about and what things, are similar, that they can be like, oh, okay, this is similar, and I can argue that it's similar because of X, Y, and Z. And then the seventh question is, do you think that the concept of the ideal American family can change throughout time, or will it stay stagnant? This is more so based on their opinion, just based on what they see on their previous knowledge, their own life experience. And again, it kind of goes back into the reading, because again, like the main focus of the reading is that in modern times there is no single definition of what an ideal American family should be. So pre-lecture, they're like, oh, like there isn't really a single definition, so I believe it won't stay stagnant, or I will believe it will stay stagnant. So at the end of the lecture, their answer to this pre-lecture question should change. So how I split off the reading in terms of content is I decided that there was three main point there were four main points that were discussed in the reading, and one of them was the American family structure, how it was mid-century ago, during the 1950s, compared to modern times, which is the next slide. And so basically, according to the reading, during the 1950s, and you can even argue earlier decades, the family structure was vastly different compared to what we see in modern times. Again, setting up that juxtaposition of what was considered the ideal American family versus what is considered now, which the answer is there is no single definition of the ideal American family. So in the 1950s, families considered of nuclear families consisting of heterosexual marriage with one or two more children. The father was the breadwinner. I provided the example that they provided in the reading, Leave It to Beaver. And then I discussed how divorce is considered controversial, and the reason why. And the reason why they're highlighted is they're the answers to my post lecture questions. So for the slides, I the highlighted portions are like the answers to my post lecture questions, And I tried to format my questions in a way that students could be like, okay, this question has to come from the slide talking about the American family structure mid-century ago versus like the modern times. And again, with this presentation, there is a further discussion about how this type of family, the nuclear family, being prized by all in society. Anyone that tried to step out of the mold were publicly shamed or their careers ended. And one of the examples that the reading provided was the divorce of New York Governor Rockefeller and his remarriage, that which stopped his presidential campaign before it started. So when it comes to this slides, I discuss another aspect that the reading touched upon, which is that contrast between American family structure, the ideal American family structure during mid-century ago, during the 1950s and earlier, versus modern times. And by now, it should be kind of for students especially, they should kind of be actively thinking like, okay, there's that juxtaposition of what an ideal family should look like versus in the 1950s versus what now. So what does that tell me? Again, this should be kind of making them think like, oh, maybe there is no set definition of the ideal American family structure. Rather, it's based on time period and other factors, which I'll talk about in the next slide. So, for example, today the traditional family unit has been replaced due to numerous changes in ideology. Again, factors that they should be thinking like, okay, there is no set definition based on time period because numerous factors take into consideration on how that changes. So the highlighted portions I have included, they're the answers to my discussion questions. So for example, divorce and remarriage has been widely accepted. The rest either live with single or step parents. And then also discussing about how there's that, especially during family roles, the relationship between a couple has gone from especially in heterosexual couples, that has gone from the man being the sole breadwinner to women preferring to have greater communication with their spouse rather than marrying for money. And then the main point that I think the reading drives home, especially, is the ideal American family is no longer like a set image of like a white picket fence with like a couple married with like 3 kids and a dog and a brand new car. Rather, it's the value of being able to communicate and have your family nurture active growth for individuals within the unit, which has been set as the ideal model. Again, showing how, again, when students are listening to this lecture, it should be kind of clicking in their head like, okay, there was never an ideal American family structure to begin with. There never was. It just depended on the context of that society at that time period, and also factors such as religion, morality, political beliefs, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So when it comes to how the ideal American family structure definition has been impacted by factors, one of my discussion questions, it asked that question, and the three are religion, politics, and social morality. And basically, how the reading puts it is that depending on where an individual from a family stands, whether if they're from a very religious standpoint or a less religious standpoint, and that can also apply to their political standpoint, whether they're Republican or a Democrat, and also their own social morality. They may follow the ideal family that was set by the 1950s model, which is a heterosexual couple with children and are married. However, there are some like, how do I say it? There are some exceptions. For example, social conservatives, again, that social morality, see divorce as morally wrong, but can be accepted if the marital spouse has been unfaithful or even abusive. Again, showing to students during this lecture that that the definition of the ideal American family structure is constantly changing. There is no set definition. Rather, it depends on the time period, the context of the politics, religion, and social morality for the ideal American family structure to be defined as. And then my last slide, which is a concept that the reading touched heavily upon, is the idea that the future of the American family structure is going to be changing regardless on where people stand in terms of morality, terms of politics, religion. And the best example that they include was regarding the teen pregnancy of a Republican governor who was very prominent at the time when this article was published, and how their daughter basically was pregnant and a teenager. And for Republicans, they frown upon teen pregnancies, simply because when it comes to Republicans, they try to have their children, abstain from sexual acts, as we see with Texas and their sexual education. But the surprise for this news, when she announced that her family unit consisted of a teenage daughter who was pregnant, it was well received. So this shows that when it comes to family units, the idea of having a family member who is pregnant and a teenager has become more acceptable. But rather, it's a slow process, and it all depends on the context of the situation and how it's said. And again, during the time that this paper was published, there was that discussion of disregard of same-sex couples and families, but there has been some movement for same-sex couples to be in more public positions, such as government positions. And I would argue that we have been seeing this firsthand with this year's midterm re-elections. I know that we had a candidate that is a same-sex couple that got elected to a governor position in one, I believe, in one of the red states. So again, that kind of shows that idea that the ideal American family structure, it really depends on the context, the factors of religion, politics, and social morality, but also if individuals themselves can see family units in high positions of power again, such as that governor and who is a lesbian that just got elected this week actually. If they're shown prominently within those positions, and it's slowly going to become acceptable. It's a slow progress, but it's going to get there. So this slide is just announcing my quiz. And for my quiz, which is my next slide, I'm going to show it right now. I decided to embed it into my Microsoft PowerPoint. So this is how the quiz should look like. It's at the top, you can see it says, "Hi Elizabeth, when you submit this form, the owner will see your name and email address." And so basically how this would work is, again, I would send out the email either through a class email or send it before they come into class, or make a QR code. And this is how the quiz should look like. And it's just basically asking some of the things that the reading has touched upon. And there's a total of 8 questions worth 8 points, so this would count as a grade. And again, it depends on how long the students take. Ideally, it should only take them like maybe 5 to 10 minutes, but it depends on if students need more time, or if we have still one student who needs to take the quiz. So this is my post-lecture discussion question. Some of them are similar to the questions I discussed for the pre-lecture. For example, describe the family unit and name the model that is prevalent with the 1950s. They can compare their previous answer with the first question of the pre-lecture with this one, and they can even use any examples that they use for that pre-lecture question as in the example that they need to include that is not found within the lecture. And then the second question is, why was divorce considered controversial during the 1950s? Again, all of my questions, the answers for these are highlighted, and I try to format the questions to the point where students can be like, okay, this question has to be from this slide because they're talking about the 1950s, which is a mid-century ago. Which there's a slide labeled a mid-century ago. And so again, the rest of my questions are similar to the pre-lecture questions, just that I'm kind of expecting that they answer the questions with the knowledge that they gained from the lecture. The seventh question though, like the pre-lecture question number 6, it's in their opinion, which I wrote. In your opinion, do you think there has been enough progress to diversify the concept of the ideal family, or should we get rid of it completely? And again, they can use their previous answer from the pre-lecture, or even add more upon it based on what they learned about the lecture. And then the goal would be afterwards, we would compare the pre-lecture answers versus the post-lecture discussion questions as a class, and discuss whether or not there has been changes in their answers from the pre-lecture to the post-lecture, or if there hasn't been any changes at all, or if they need further clarification.